Joining me now via Skype from London is hip-hop artist and activist Lowkey, who passionately campaigned for justice for the entire community around Grenfell. Thanks so much for coming back on the show, Lowkey. Now, you know, the Tory government has overseen, arguably, the killing of tens of thousands of people, disproportionately people of colour. Why is it so important tomorrow to commemorate what happened at Grenfell when 72 people died, given how many people have died during the COVID epidemic?
Well, there are a few reasons. The first of them is that Grenfell, as a state crime, is not completely exceptional in British history. It's something that has a shared lineage with other incidents. In fact, when we talk about the deaths that have taken place, especially in the initial period from COVID-19, we are talking about gross negligence on the part of the state. And when we look at the fire in Grenfell, we see that it comes along a line which has largely been invisibilized by what's happened in the inquiry. We have seen the word deregulation never used, whereas the legislation that was passed in 1981 by Michael Heseltine, that was opposed by many saying this bill will kill, he put it this way: it would allow greater self-regulation for corporations and less pesky government interference. What happened was 300 or so pages were taken from building regulations and left with about 25 or so. Also, along the way, you had the approved document be added, which has within it creative ambiguities which allow the space for interpretation on the part of companies to install things that are either of limited combustibility or seemingly of worse than limited combustibility. In fact, the kind of evidence that we have access to, such as Celotex that fitted the RS5000 on Grenfell, which has turned out to be fatal, collaborating and cooperating on how Celotex could rig the tests. So while on one hand, you of course have a virus which you are 4.2 times more likely to die from if you are a black man, you also have the fire at Grenfell Tower. Number one, a tower named after Francis Wallace Grenfell, who was an officer in the British Army who killed for empire in Sudan, South Africa, and Egypt. But also, Danny Dorling found...
Oxford academic Professor Danny Dorling.
Those that live above the fourth floor in tower blocks across this country are more likely to be black and ethnic minorities. They are the majority of those that live above the fourth floor. So there's many ways in which the current political moment and Grenfell actually come together, and you can see those overlaps quite clearly. It's about corporate irresponsibility, but it's also about necropolitics and the ways that those who are racialized in certain ways seem to be more likely to fall victim to state discretions or state crime.
Obviously, we invite Michael Heseltine on to dispute how his legislation may have contributed, and all the state entities deny what you're saying. In fact, Boris Johnson says we'll have an inquiry later, and the government here did have an inquiry. It's going on now. You keep talking about corporations. We already know that the Attorney General, Suella Braverman, is saying that the corporations must be indemnified and must be immunized from legal action post-inquiry. What do you make of that? Why do you think they're doing that? And I should say all the entities deny wrongdoing, and certainly the state here denies actively trying to kill people off using coronavirus.
In terms of the inquiry and the way that it is being used to defang the criminal case, it has seen companies claim for immunity from the evidence that they put in forth during the inquiry, immunity from that evidence being used to prosecute them. Now, there's a huge leap of faith supposedly being taken by Morbick when he says, surely the police will already have enough evidence. But actually what we're seeing is that not only is the inquiry muzzling the press. You know, I remember being on LBC a year after the fire, and I was told by James O'Brien, don't say anything about the companies, don't say anything about Sajid Javid, because I don't want to be responsible for prejudicing the inquiry. And during that show, I was even accused, this is behind the scenes, of being like Tommy Robinson, because I wanted to talk about the crimes of corporations towards people in my community.
Tommy Robinson, a well-known alleged racist. I should say to our international viewers that James O'Brien, he's blocked me, but we do invite him on to stand that up. Keep going.
Towards somebody I knew from the age of 14 years old. There were stories that had come out about the relationship between Mark Allen and Sajid Javid. Sajid Javid, housing minister at the time of Grenfell. Mark Allen, the technical director of Celotex, one of the companies who fit the RS5000. It was their material. They said they misdescribed the results of it in a test because it didn't meet the criteria to be limited combustibility. I was told I can't speak about that because I might prejudice the inquiry. Well, number one, an inquiry doesn't involve a jury, so you can't prejudice it. And the way in which the community has also been muzzled about speaking about these things. These companies have enjoyed an invisibility rarely seen, I have to say. And I feel, with the exception of yourself, obviously, with the exception of Rags Martel at ITV, with the exception of even some work done at Sky News, and of course, the amazing Inside Housing, we have not seen the media take these companies to task the way they should have. 72 people died and nobody knows the names of these companies. I know campaigners myself who lost family members, who have been blacklisted for the past 3 years, unable to work. They have attempted to get jobs and been told that their name has been flagged. Why has their name been flagged? Because they've gone publicly on the media and said the names of these corporations. Let me ask you something, Afshin. The Stephen Lawrence campaign was infiltrated. The Stephen Lawrence campaign was spied upon. The Stephen Lawrence family was spied upon. Upon the surface of it, it was a murder that didn't necessarily indict or condemn the state. What do you think was mobilized to deal with this community? What level of surveillance do you think has been mobilized to deal with us here? And what has been the main tool to pin us to an orthodoxy which is about stealing justice?
Well, the corporations deny any wrongdoing. Sajid Javid obviously has been fired by Boris Johnson, apparently by Dominic Cummings. Who knows? We invite him on the show. Lowkey, I'll stop you there. More from Lowkey after this short break. Welcome back. I'm still here with hip-hop artist and activist Lowkey. As to Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered, we had that inquiry ordered by the government, the Macpherson report, and the government inspector of constabulary appointed, Wendy Williams, said, look, this was institutionally ignorant. This was not institutionally racist within the police force of this country. So what do you make of institutional ignorance rather than the much more incendiary term, arguably, institutional racism?
People are having their names, children are having their names placed on the gangs matrix, which is a government database, which increases surveillance upon those children and is intrusive, and public sector workers are being encouraged to take part in it for merely being the victims of crime. So if you're a 14-year-old who has a problem and suffers, you may well then come under the gang's matrix form of surveillance. You're far more likely to end up on that if you are a black youth. You're 9 times more likely to be stopped by police if you are a black youth. Ethnic minorities make up 13% of the population in this country. They make up 40% of the prison population. You are far more likely, 70% of those in prison are people that have been excluded from schools. What are the rates and the likelihoods of people being excluded from schools along lines of race? How is it that something like that could take place without some form of institutional racism operating towards certain people?
The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea say that £200 million, the council there saying, for 300 homes, supporting 194 households from Grenfell with a home of their home. 7 households remain in private rented accommodation, 5 accepted a permanent home, 2 households currently being supported. Look, moving on from Grenfell, Do you not see that these authorities' excuses can be believable? I mean, the government Boris Johnson served in, there was the mass deportation of people of colour, the so-called Windrush affair. The landing cards were destroyed at the Home Office of immigrant arrival dates. Could that not just be an innocent mistake?
Well, I'll ask you a question. The way you can tell a state is attempting to atone for what it has done, when we look at the characters who along this sordid tale have played such destructive roles. Gavin Barwell, who ignored 7 warnings about fire safety prior to Grenfell, has been rewarded with a place in the House of Lords. He is guested upon mainstream news as if he is some type of oracle on politics. What about Amber Rudd, the person personally responsible for the Windrush scandal, for the deportation? She resigned, but look at where she is and how she is treated in the public space today. This is not a person that has been expected to apologise and atone for what she has done. Alistair Campbell was responsible for seemingly fiddling a dossier to the wants of the US intelligence services in order to kill Iraqis, people racialized as Arabs and Muslims. How is this man treated in the public sphere today? Is he treated as the pariah, as the unethical operator that he is? Of course he isn't. Quite the opposite of that.
Well, Tony Blair's former communications advisor obviously just said it was about bringing Saddam Hussein down, but indeed worked on attacking a program I used to work on. We do invite him on the show. You mentioned intelligence services. What have you made of the fact that UK state security forces are admitting to contracting out Instagram and Facebook accounts to something called Stoosh? It's a part of the Prevent program, a secret program to encourage, well, I suppose more woke debate, they might say.
Well, it's absolutely the tip of the iceberg. And I'll be interested to hear what kind of response you get on this from Angela Davis when thinking that Prevent were using her image, of course, without her permission or consent in any way, shape or form. I'm a person who's been informed that Prevent use my music videos in training sessions. I don't know for what purpose, and I don't know in what context those videos are being used.
Why do you think they would use your videos?
There's a number of possibilities. It could be informing others in the public sector. And let's not forget that Prevent now also applies to the private sector. You have people in Tesco, McDonald's, River Island agreeing to take part in the Prevent program. But possibly it's to tell people in the private sector, if they catch young people listening to my music, then they may be on the conveyor belt towards committing acts of political violence. Now, let's not forget that Prevent actually applies to children as young as 3. So what that means is that police can question 3-year-olds without the presence of their parents, merely if that 3-year-old expresses some form of solidarity with the Palestinians. It is down to personal interpretation of the person working in that role. Also, the justification for Prevent is a lot of stuff that generally is covered in the duty of care. The Equality Act in 2010 prohibits teachers discriminating against people on the basis of their religion or their political belief. Now, what Prevent is requiring these people to do is directly go against the Equalities Act of 2010. It's dangerous, it's totalitarian, and really it has no space in a free society. But unfortunately, it is invisible through its ubiquity within our society. It has become the common sense norm. This is a form of state-sanctioned Islamophobia.
Well, Professor Angela Davis will be on Monday's show, and the state security apparatus in Britain completely claim that Prevent is actually a counter-terror measure and nothing to do with totalitarianism. But I know you talk there about education. What have you made of educational standards during this uproar about the tearing down of a statue of a slave trader in Bristol, because a lot of people on the so-called left appalled that Winston Churchill, one of Britain's greatest heroes, his statue in Parliament Square could be vandalized. Although, of course, Shashi Tharoor on this show, an Indian politician, said he was the worst genocidal dictator, one of them, of the 20th century.
Well, let's not forget that 59% of the British public believed the empire was something to be proud of. And of course, as Pankaj Mishra put it, when the colonies were subjugated, they were subjugated by people they had long considered upstarts, if not barbarians. Let's not forget that China was producing steel a millennium and a half before the Europeans and the British specifically. They were having printed press about half a millennium before the British. Between the years of 1757 and 1900, Britain's per capita GDP actually increased by 347%. And what is happening now is the revenge of that history. You have people in some cases, the first time in their lives, because they're not being educated about it in schools, coming to terms with the fact that, as Gominda Bambra puts it, Britain didn't have an empire, Britain was an empire. And what was the nature of that empire? It was an opium peddling, concentration camp inventing, rape as a form of torture using, person strapped to cannonball shooting, castrating, commodifying of human beings, child enslaving, document burning, anti-gay legislating, famine causing, horrendous empire of thievery, which plainly is rejected by the rest of the world. In a period where it's projected that China will overtake the United States as the world's #1 economy by 2030, where the 20 fastest developing and growing economies, none of them are in Europe, and some of them are former British colonies, this attitude that the British government has of unanswerability and unaccountability for the past is not sustainable. The MOD had to pay out around £20 million to victims, people who are still alive in Kenya, who had suffered in the concentration camps that the British had there, post-Second World War, I might remind you, where people to this day are living the effects of castration at the hands of British forces. People were burnt alive in those situations. They had to pay the MOD over £22 million to families of Iraqis who had died at the hands of the British. You also are in a place where the Caribbean nations have got together and are big and have, since 2013, been building a campaign for reparations from the ravages of British imperialism. The chickens are coming home to roost. And the reality is that this position that Britain takes of keeping its looted wares within the British Museum, as David Cameron said, if we were to allow one object to leave the British Museum, next thing you turn around and find the entire museum was empty.
Well, let alone changing the names of streets. Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, Western Europe's one of its largest socialist movements, built up, of course, under his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, he says it's completely wrong to bring down that statue of the slave trader in Bristol. Why would a leader sponsored by working-class trade union movements in this country say it was completely wrong? In fact, it should be in the museum.
Because Keir Starmer is tied in an umbilical way to the same neoliberal, necropolitical orthodoxy that the Conservative Party are tied to. Look at his record. What has he done that has helped people in a tangible and serious way in his position at the head of the CPS? The same CPS that didn't prosecute the police over the death of Ian Tomlinson. The same CPS that has been complicit in so many crimes of the British state. Now, he can take as many gestures as he wants by going on his knees, same position taken by the Democrats in the United States. Look at the damage that Joe Biden and others did to the African-American population. You're talking about a situation where, again, while they make up around 13% of the population. They are, again, 40% of the prison population in the United States.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer claims that he made those decisions about police killing because there was not enough evidence. I've got to ask you that he doesn't support boycott, divestment, sanctions as regards the atrocities in the Middle East. What have you made of the European Court? The European Court's overturning French convictions of protesters who wanted people to boycott goods from Israel.
Well, I think what we have to be wary of is this lawfare that in the United States we've seen it happening, in Germany, obviously France, they're trying it, but here, Boris Johnson made clear in his Queen's speech that he intends to take as many measures as possible to stamp out this important practice of boycott, divestment and sanctions. We're now going to go into the next phase of what the British government wants to do, which is to push further forward and crush it within universities and other places, and councils particularly.
Lowkey, thank you.
Thank you.
We invite the Israeli ambassador on. That's it for the show. We'll be back on Monday when, after another weekend of mass international protest, we speak to philosopher Professor Angela Davis, former US communist politician, allied to the Black Panthers and apparently on the FBI's top most wanted list. Until then, wash your hands and join the underground by following us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and SoundCloud.